Welcome to Counterintelligence. This is Eric LeVay. Today's guest is Professor Ruth Ben-Ghiat, an expert in authoritarianism at New York University. Forensic News thanks our Patreons Angela J., Craig P., and Jim R. Support Forensic News and Counterintelligence on Patreon. Without further ado, here's the show. Professor Ruth Ben-Ghiat, welcome to Counterintelligence.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for doing this. So, Professor, you're an expert in history and you're a professor in history and authoritarianism. I was wondering, I wanted to ask you the big picture question first, which is, in your professional opinion, what about Donald Trump? What authoritarian kind of qualities does he have, for lack of a better phrase?
Donald Trump, in his personality and his methods, he pretty much maps onto the authoritarian personality 100%.
Wow.
He doesn't have the control of the government that past people had, or somebody like Putin or even Orban, but his attitudes toward the press, his use of violent language, calling the press traitors, his demand for absolute loyalty from everyone who is around him, and his bullying. Many things are his distrust of his own intelligence services and attitude, toward anyone who doesn't agree with him. All of this maps on to authoritarian leaders. So,
and I'm just curious, when all this started, let's say, as an expert in this, did you see this coming from the minute he came down the escalator, or when did you? I mean, when did he first jump out as that type of person to you?
I started writing about him pretty early in 2015, the fall of 2015. And the first thing I noticed was I saw some video of one of his rallies. And he was having people do the loyalty oath. And it was very clear to me that he was cultivating a kind of personality cult. So his behavior at rallies, the way he was rallying them up to have enemies, all of this seemed very familiar to me. And then when he started retweeting neo-Nazi, anti-Semitic, anti-immigrant propaganda, basically racist propaganda from right-wing sources, this was also a big sign. So I started doing some op-eds for CNN already in the fall of 2015.
Yeah, I remember that propaganda well, and I'm Jewish, and when I saw that, like the alarm bells start going off. I was like, wait a minute, like the whole one with the quote unquote sheriff's star, and I guess it's just still shocking that this whole thing even happened. I mean, we can all remember times where. What happened? Howard Dean spoke too loudly and his campaign was over? Whatever happened to that?
Yeah, what happens in history is sometimes there are these moments, and they're usually moments of some kind of transition in society where certain people feel threatened, often white males, especially white Christian males. And these characters come up into politics. Often they come from outside of politics. They're not professional politicians. And they kind of coalesce all of these anxieties, dissatisfactions, and hatreds that were in the culture. And they have this charisma and this ability to kind of have everything swirl around them. And that's why I say coalesce. And once they get into power, they have great ability to harness and direct people's hatreds, which is what we're seeing in our country. And one of the most telling things is that lots of Americans were already anti-immigrant. Lots of Americans were anti-Semitic, anti-Muslim. But one hatred that Trump has been able to kind of whip up, not out of nowhere, but certainly in an unprecedented manner, is hatred toward the press. Because there was always the kind of Fox News, conservative, shading into right-wing radio that didn't trust the liberal media, but there was no level of hatred with threats and T-shirts that say, let's hang journalists. This is all Donald Trump's doing. So that's very notable that he has been able to have this power over people to marshal these feelings, and that's the scariest thing.
In other examples in history, have other authoritarian-style leaders been that successful at demonizing the press, or do you think that he's different in that respect?
All of the authoritarian leaders demonize the press, and they have very good reasons for doing so in their minds, because when they're still getting power or until they kind of domesticate the press, like Putin's been able to do, attacking and trying to delegitimize and discredit the press is a kind of insurance policy for them, because most of them are very corrupt, and they know very well that they have lots of secrets they don't want uncovered. So when those things come to light because of investigative journalists, for example, they need people to already be indoctrinated to hate the press.
Right.
So Trump's been extraordinarily successful with the full, support of Rupert Murdoch and Fox, he has a very symbiotic relationship with Fox, unlike anything I've seen, even in regimes, I would say.
Wow. So
he's been very successful at doing this, and that's whatever happens to Trump, that's going to be a big problem for our country.
Just purely on just my brain always kind of works on the comedic level, even no matter what's going on. You referenced these people at these Trump rallies who are wearing these shirts demonizing journalists, and the comedian in me thinks, why would you spend that much of your day upset over I feel like we all have so much going on in our lives. I'm just like, why would so much of your energy be directed towards hating somebody you don't even know? It just seems a strange way to go about your life. I guess that's my personal commentary on that. Well,
because what these leaders do is they make people feel included by giving them a common enemy to hate. And in the case of Trump and the journalists, all successful rulers have rituals. And their rallies, if you listen to people who go to Trump's rallies, they have a really good time. They enjoy themselves. It's fun. Yeah. And they love to chant "lock her up." So, for example, something I found really revealing is obviously Trump needed to have the whole "lock her up" thing during the campaign because this was his political opponent, Hillary Clinton. After he won, there was a little period where he would go to rallies and he would say, "We don't need to do that chant anymore because it's over." But he found that, because remember, he's a marketer, and everything he does, the rallies are like his focus group. So he found that it was really popular, that people needed to chant, "I hate the press," "down with CNN," and "lock her up." So that's why it seems absurd to everybody why, the campaign is over. It's been over for years, and yet people are still chanting that.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I remember I used to work with some folks who I'm sure this was a while ago, but I'm sure they became rabid Trump supporters. And I just remember once, it's like an office environment. And I remember just making a remark once, a critical remark of President Bush. And I was shocked by the reaction I got. It was like a rabid type of reaction. Like I had not criticized, I had attacked them personally and our country. And it really took me aback. It's not an attack on, it's really something emotional with these people, is it not?
It is. And in the case of Bush, he wasn't trying on purpose to whip people up into a frenzy. What's different about Trump is he really does use the methods of authoritarian leaders. Yeah. And that's why I focused on the loyalty, on only I can fix it, only I am right. This kind of thing has rarely been seen in presidents, even corrupt ones like Nixon, who had some similar personality traits, but Trump goes way beyond it. And there's a reason. His first wife Ivana said once that in his bedroom he only had 2 books, and one was, of course, The Art of the Deal, and the other was Hitler's speeches.
Wow, that's almost too on the nose. Like if I wrote that as a screenwriter, the producer would just be like, no. but it's
well,
true.
There's a lot of almost every single day now, and I'm one of these people who, looks through Twitter for the first round of my news gathering every day.
Sure.
And I see things that I think are the Onion. They're satire, and then they turn out not to be.
There was one today. It was it was the Onion, but you can't tell. It was Bolton tells Iran, to stop bucking under him, like he was basically pumping up Iran to feel better. And I was like, oh, I could see him doing that to antagonize them.
Yeah, and the other thing that's really disturbing that happens when you have rulers like Trump is they are not the most honest people, and so they end up populating government with people who are dishonest like them. And so corruption becomes much more common. Mm-hmm. You also tend to have even like felons. In fact, in 2018, several convicted felons ran for office with the GOP. You have an awful lot of people who've cycled through his cabinet who have accusations of domestic violence, sexual assault, including on the Supreme Court now.
Yep. So
this is a very unfortunate effect of having somebody in office who has so much baggage. And just today, New York Magazine has a cover story of someone else who was assaulted by him years ago.
I read the article. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, so this is a byproduct, and in my work I'm doing, which is this historical and comparative work for this book I'm writing called Strongmen, this is something that happens every time you get a lot of kind of criminals in office.
That's absolutely fascinating. Is the book going to be coming out soon, or when can we read this?
It will be coming out sometime in 2020, not before the summer. So.
Good. And hopefully, maybe by then I'm really looking forward to reading it, and I hope maybe by then we'll have some kind of. Well, who am I kidding? We won't have any resolution on this situation, but I would like to believe that. I did want to go back to the press for a sec. I'm sure you saw as a frequent Twitter user, and so am I, that some members of the press are throwing a little after work drinks for Sarah Huckabee.
I did see that. I think this is the most misguided thing possible, because I've said from the very start, the first time that Trump insulted the press and he told, I believe it was Jim Acosta, to sit down, I tweeted that based on, my knowledge of these guys, these kinds of rulers, what everyone needed to do was show solidarity and stand up. And I guarantee you, if at the very beginning, if the press had been aggressively in solidarity with one another, he would be acting in slightly different manner. So to give a party for a professional propagandist, which is what Sanders and Kellyanne Conway, these are professional paid propagandists. To give a party for someone like that is normalizing all of their lies.
Do you have, as an expert in this topic, do you have any insight into the psychology of those particular press members, or is it the same as the psychology of any enabler of an authoritarian?
So it means somebody like Sanders, or like her friends in the press corps?
Yeah, the ones in the. I'm just curious. Like, is there any? I'm curious about their personal psychology of why they would want to, let's say, throw a party for someone who's spent 2 years or a year or whatever insulting them to their face. I mean, what is that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think that there's always a lot of denial. I think that it's very threatening. What is happening in our country now is very upsetting. It's very frightening. It's threatening. So a lot of people, especially if they depend on access to the White House for doing their jobs and distinguishing themselves, versus their colleagues, they can be the most in denial of all, because they want to make nice. They want to feel that Sarah Sanders is not really. I see these people as subversives of democracy. I see them I'm very hardcore about this stuff.
Exactly.
And that's not an attitude a lot of people like to take, and it's easier to pretend that everything's okay and raise a glass of champagne together. And personal life is that one thing, business is another. But the problem is in these times when you have an authoritarian trying to, take over, the personal versus the business is very blurred.
Yeah, it's very strange. I mean, I've watched this as you have in real time, and like you said, if just at the beginning they just stood together and said, you know what, no, maybe you can give us some historical perspective, but in other examples of authoritarianism, or let's say in other examples in the world, were those people, the leaders, they don't seem like very smart people, yet so many people are unable to fight them. Is it usually like that? It's just not.
It is. One of the things that you see over and over again is that the opposition does not unite against them. Mm-hmm. And the other thing that you see is that these people are bullies, and everything they do is testing and challenging. This is why Trump said before he even had the nomination that he could stand on Fifth Avenue and shoot someone, which was like a very bizarre thing. Who in their right mind would say such a violent thing when they're trying to get the nomination?
Right.
But what he was doing was telling people he was violent and he is capable of, or he's capable of ordering violence, and he's above the law. So it's a very smart strategy, and what happens is over and over again is people get intimidated. But what I'm very sad about is a lot of the cases I study, you have people who have taken over with paramilitaries, you have military coups, and there are huge physical consequences for speaking out. You go to jail, you get beaten up. Here, there are no real consequences yet in that way.
Right.
And yet people are very cowardly, and they don't want to speak up. They don't want to sit down when he insults someone or stand up. They don't want to do the big gesture. And that bothers me. And I also think that Americans don't have any idea what it's like because they can take their democracy for granted. And the mail, a lot of the mail I get, especially early on when I was one of the first people to be very outspoken. I used to get a lot of mail from people who fled regimes. Wow. Who fled like either communist regimes or military coups, and they would write to me and say, thank you for seeing this, but why is no one else seeing it? Yeah.
It's amazing. You think of I can imagine like ghosts of my ancestors who met very unfortunate ends with, regimes like that, and they would just be like apoplectic,
Yeah. So we go back to the denial, which again, people say, and I'm not comparing what we're going through now to the 1930s Germany.
Sure.
But people say, well, why didn't the Jews leave when it was clear what was going on, even in the mid-30s? And there is denial. People want to believe that it's just going to be fine.
Yeah.
Some people can't leave. They don't have the means to leave. But we should know better because we have the benefit of history.
And again, I go back to on the human level. We've now learned that Trump was the basis for the character of Biff in Back to the Future, one of the greatest movies ever. And audiences get so much, I don't know if you're a fan of the movies or not, but there's so much enjoyment, visceral enjoyment in that movie when finally the protagonist knocks that character out, and audiences go crazy. And I don't understand why we have right now the real life version, and anybody, I don't mean like physically that should happen, but I just mean these, like going back to the White House, if you're face to face with this guy, why would you not just tell him the truth? You could become an American hero if one reporter just said, you're a huge liar.
Yeah, this is a source of frustration to many of us, including, professional critics of the press like Jay Rosen or Margaret Sullivan. And some of them say it's the model of journalism, which is access journalism. If you do that, you'll be banned, basically. And they don't want to risk it because than especially if they're a White House correspondent, and he's already revoked a lot of press credentials.
Yeah.
And if you work for a big outlet, you can get reassigned, but they're again, in my book, the consequences are very small compared to the things that I'm studying. But I have been very disappointed that people have these wonderful primetime on-air chances to shame him and to stand up to him, and they're just not taking them. It's
crazy. Like, I literally would give anything to be in that situation and just be able to speak freely, like do what I do. And I don't know, maybe Forensic News will be able to get a pass in there. Probably not, though. I'm guessing it's hard to get approved at this point. They don't even have meetings anymore. So
they don't know, and that's a sign of what these authoritarians are deathly afraid of questions, and they're actually very weak people, and so they wall themselves off. They surround themselves with family. They hire their family and loyalists.
Yeah.
And they don't want to be facing the press. They all do this, and we're living through this process in real time, which is pretty amazing if you step back and can be objective, but it's also quite frightening.
Yeah. What are on the opposite front, what are the characteristics of a person, let's say even yourself or myself, who does not respond to authoritarianism? Are there qualities in people like that, like us?
What do you mean?
Why does one person respond to someone like Donald Trump and someone else just, would tell him to, F off or whatever?
Oh, that's an interesting. Yeah, that's like the $64,000 question.
Just curious.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, we can't just say that all Trump supporters are stupid, because that's absolutely not right.
Sure.
Or ignorant. That's really condescending. They tend to be people who are looking for, they feel threatened. They feel that they want a savior to make things better in their lives. But some of it does have to do with education. But that's a quality. And then some people are more susceptible to respond to these charismatic male leader figures, and it happens over and over again.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Recently in the news, I mean, when I say recently, I mean in the last week or two, or have there been any stories that stood out to you as a further example of how this country's going down this dark road? Anything that jumped out at you?
No, there's so many things.
Yeah, that's true.
I'm trying to think of just one. I'm very worried about the corruption and the way that while we're distracted by the Mueller report and the impeachment, lack of impeachment proceedings, his administration is stripping America and selling it for parts. The EPA, there are big changes taking place at the level of bureaucracy, which can seem very boring to people, but are very important. There's been huge purges of bureaucracy where people have either left because of hostile work climates or they've been fired. And he's reshaping the bureaucracy to be able to do the things he wants to do. Think about who has to be working at Homeland Security to do all the paperwork of these kind of camps where kids are dying. You have to have the right kind of people there who are going to want to do that work. So that's something that's a story that's behind the scenes a little bit. And I am worried about that.
Right, exactly. Like the footage, which has now gone semi-viral, of the United States attorney attempting to argue why kids shouldn't be able to bathe or have toothbrushes, which I know you saw.
Yeah. And this, because authoritarians need bureaucrats to do their evil work. And what happens after a while is there's a cultural shift, and this is part of having crooks come to power. But you also have people who are, in my book, they lack morals. They don't care about human life. And then you get into a really bad situation.
Yeah. Why, on that note, maybe you could just comment on the Democrats' strategy or whatever they're doing. I mean, any thoughts on...
Lack thereof.
Yes. I think we're on the same. Yeah. What's going on there?
I've like many, I've been frustrated with the hesitancy of the Democratic leadership to pursue impeachment hearings. And my particular reason for being frustrated is knowing the psychology and the methods of authoritarians. They only respond to forceful pushback.
Exactly.
And the worst thing you can do is, it's like the schoolyard bully, but magnified and with nuclear, weapons. The worst thing you can do is talk about maybe standing up to him in public and then not do it, because he's just going to feel more and more empowered to do the things he wants to do, which are not going to be in the national interest. So I've been quite upset about that.
I keep saying that we should all chip in for a psychiatrist Trump needs one too, but for the Democrats. I just reading the story today where Representative Nadler was saying that it's actually good that Hope Hicks didn't say anything because he's going to use that I was laughing. It was like when someone tells you the check's in the mail or the rationalization.
Yeah, and the problem with this is that these people need to be forced to testify in public,
right,
because this is also about holding them accountable. And it's very different for Hope Hicks to have to be seated with the television cameras on her.
Right.
Or, of course, all of the hearings and things. And of course, the purpose of the impeachment hearings, whatever happens, is to provide the nation with, a kind of real-time record of people answering questions about their wrongdoing, and this is why people feel so frustrated.
Yeah. I just want to ask you two more things. The first is where, in your professional opinion, and as of course just an American, where do you see this going? Where are we going right now as a country? How will we end up?
Yeah, well, it could be nowhere good fast if Bolton gets his way and we go to war with Iran. I have, various scenarios about what could happen in the election. I think it's be very important to register as many Democratic voters as possible, because we're going to need a massive win to counter any manipulation that is happening and is being actively encouraged.
Right.
You have passive encouragement by refusing to hear about. Trump doesn't even want to hear about infiltration and manipulation. So it's very, and one thing that's very scary is people are starting to accept that, oh yes, we are going to just have an unfair election. So that's a difficult situation. I feel that if he wins again, he's going to move even faster to consolidate his power. And we don't know what that will look like exactly, but I also am worried about, I was thinking the military would oppose him more, because so many retired generals have been so outspoken. But that was an early period I went through, and now I feel the Pentagon is completely domesticated.
Wow.
And they've gotten a lot more money. They are in charge of security clearances. They're agreeing to, be involved with migrant removal.
Yeah. So
there's going to be like a forever war on the border, and that will be their role. And that's not good either. So I wish I could be more optimistic, but because I am an optimist by nature about human beings, but I don't see, unless he's simply defeated in a fair and free election, I don't see any good scenarios coming out of this.
What jumped out at me as what I thought was a turning point in everything that's happened was the other day when he told, George Stephanopoulos, I'm going to do it again. I'll commit treason.
Yeah.
And,
well, authoritarians always tell you what they're going to do.
Oh.
They always tell you what they're going to do, and we just don't know what to do with the information, or we don't want to believe it.
What shocked me was, I think I said this on another show, was not even that was shocking, but what really shocked me was the next day. I was like, okay, Democrats have to do something. Nope. I'm sort of at a loss for words at this point, I guess. I'm still trying to figure out how a person who literally looked into an eclipse intimidates people. Like, I keep going back to that. It's just amazing.
Yeah, he talks a good game, and people fall for it.
So, just one more question. What can every American do to fight this in their own way?
I think everyone has their own way that they can get involved to oppose this. Nonviolent mass protest is very effective. We're kind of in an exhaustion moment, so there's not much going on of that. Working for clean elections, for voter registration is very, very important, because all these other things that we debate in the press, it really all comes down to who's going to vote. If people don't vote, then all the rest, all the op-eds, all of it doesn't mean anything. So that is an important thing to focus on. No matter what happens, and then we have to come out in such huge numbers that it'll be much harder to pull any of that nonsense. That's right.
Well, Professor Ruth Ben-Ghiat, I really want to thank you for talking to Counterintelligence, and I really hope we can do it again soon.
Yes. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening. Follow Forensic News on Twitter at Forensic Newsnet. Counterintelligence is at IntelPod. My personal account is Eric LeVay. Support Forensic News on Patreon. Sponsors can contact Counterpod at protonmail.com. Subscribe to Counterintelligence everywhere you listen to podcasts. Take care.